Hello?
Hi, Ben.
Hi, Charles. Can I ask a question?
Paul is probably the person to ask it of, who will come in a minute.
Okay, got it.
Hi there, Ben. We are now live. If I can ask you to mute yourself and turn off your video, and we'll be in the chat for any questions you may have.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. A warm welcome to our conference on Rewilding the Sea. My name is Charles Clover, and I'm Executive Director of the Blue Marine Foundation, Blue for short. I would like to thank you all, particularly our exciting speakers, for giving up time to be here on this lovely day. I still wish we had been able to do this conference in the flesh, in the magnificent Navy boardrooms of Somerset House. Even though it might have been a bit hot today, it would have been fun. We could have networked in the intervals and discussed the day over a drink on the terrace in the evening. I'm afraid that today you will have to make your own catering arrangements. The advantage of doing this digitally, however, which we hope to do more in the future, is that we have been able to invite inspiring people from all over the world and think of the carbon emissions we've saved. Our conference, Rewilding the Sea, is based on the romantic but eminently achievable idea that you can nurse nature back to health. Who would not want to experience the bountiful seas of the past? Recent experience during the lockdown shows just how quickly nature steps in if we humans step aside. If we possibly can, I would like to avoid this being a discussion about who we would like to exclude from this or that bit of sea. We want to be fully inclusive. All sorts of sectors and all sorts of people have something to gain from rewilding our seas. Wind farm developers, port and harbour operators, fishermen, water companies, ship owners, even aggregate extractors, for we all have an interest in healthier seas and defending ourselves against the worst effects of climate change. A lot of the discussion today will be about protection, but we need to give credit to enlightened management too. Who can say that the recovery of the bluefin tuna has not been part of rewilding the sea? I think we would all agree that some other pioneers of rewilding are the potters and netters of Lyme Bay, who said no to scallop dredging and helped to rewild the Lyme Bay reefs. An accommodation between people and nature that works has an obvious value that we can admire, though it might not fit neatly into the spectrum of lightly, highly, or fully protected marine protected areas beloved of conservationists. This conference is timely for three reasons. First, because Brexit is giving the UK an opportunity to control tracts of sea that we never really managed before, certainly not for nature conservation. And it's made clear for the first time in perhaps a century that the public owns the right to fish. So the public will expect that right to be fairly distributed and not to damage the environment. The second reason this conference is timely is because marine conservation has never had so high a profile, though it is still some years behind rewilding on land. Third, and more modestly, this conference is timely for us at Blue, as we are 10 this year, and having this discussion is a fitting way to mark that anniversary. Today, we would like to discuss rewilding the sea in the broadest terms and involve all points of view in that discussion. Healthy seas matter to us all, and everyone knows there are synergies to discuss and obstacles to overcome. I will be popping up again at the end, around 2:30, in an attempt to summarize where I think the discussion has led. In a moment, we are going to show you a short film containing some of the themes and ambitions of the day. But first, it is my great pleasure to introduce one of Blue's oldest friends, whom we were proud to support in his campaign to save the bluefin tuna, the head of Europe's most ocean-friendly dynasty, His Serene Highness, Prince Albert of Monaco.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, The topic bringing us together is, in my view, of paramount importance. It is a central issue for the future of the polluted and overexploited oceans which are on the agenda of this conference. More generally, it is also a central issue for our era and perhaps for our civilization, because it entails defining what humanity can and cannot do to nature. It prompts us to question the expansion of human activities, of our activities. Rewilding nature is a new challenge. For a long time, our only challenge, and sometimes the key to our survival, was to control nature, to humanize it, so to speak, to become its master and possessor, in the words of the French philosopher René Descartes, who believed this to be the goal of science, the essential condition to enjoy nature and its fruits. We know the excess to which this led. Every day we see the damage of our power, and more importantly, we know that this power is constantly growing at the same time as our needs, our greed, and our ambitions. I do not believe it is possible to limit these needs, nor these ambitions. However, I do believe it is possible to find a solution that is not based on the negation of nature, of its equilibrium and its laws. In this respect, I believe that marine protected areas present highly relevant opportunities which prove that another approach vis-à-vis the natural environment is possible, one which is not only respectful of the ecosystems but able to satisfy human needs. For decades, marine protected areas have proven their concern for nature can have positive effects on the economy, on the local economy with the promotion of sustainable activities, and more generally on the regional economy, because we can see that by banning fishing in some areas, we have been able to regenerate fish stocks, thus give rise to more productive fishing in the surrounding areas. That is why, with my foundation, we have taken to develop marine protected areas. We do so in the Mediterranean with MedFund, a trust fund set up with France and Tunisia to promote the expansion and coordination of marine protected areas. And we do so in other seas by supporting local initiatives. Because it is vital today to develop marine protected areas, which still represent only a few percent of the planet's marine surface, when it is increasingly the recommendation of scientists that they should cover 30% of all sea areas. It is therefore urgent to make people understand the benefits they offer for current generations as well as for future generations. In this respect, I believe that the goal of rewilding nature involves rewilding also our minds by agreeing to understand the huge benefits humanity can reap from this movement. Rewilding should not be a loss for humanity, but on the contrary, an opportunity. That is why I was keen to lend my support to your excellent initiative. Thank you.
What we mean by rewilding the sea is any effort to improve the health of the ocean by leaving it alone to recover or actively restoring habitats and species. Our aim is to get back to intact, thriving marine ecosystems in rude health and at their full potential.
Rewilding not only secures a future for a whole host of marine species and habitats, but these new marine powerhouses of life can help us deliver our climate change objectives. Healthy ecosystems fix and store huge amounts of carbon.
Left alone to thrive, areas of rewilded sea could provide benefits to fisheries and the communities around them, replenishing stocks and creating nurseries for key species, for all of us, for generations to come.
Serious ambition is urgently needed and at scale. We talk about saving nature, but this is about nature saving us. We can't go on simply undermining the very fabric of the system that ultimately supports us. We need to think big and act now.
We are now entering the United Nations Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. This is our moment.
It's time for us to rethink how we do things, working together better across governments, industry, environmental bodies and academia, protecting our coasts and supporting fisheries.
From oyster reefs to mangroves, from America to Africa and Asia, restoration successes are happening all over. Marine restoration really does work, and we're getting better at it all the time. We've made a good start. exciting things are happening, and we've learnt that every sea and coast can benefit.
Rewilding is seriously underfunded and not yet taken seriously in politics. It's an essential for everyone. We need the ocean thriving and punching at its full power if we're going to avert planetary disaster.
Today, while marine protected areas cover 6% of global ocean surface, fully protected areas are less than 1%. Many of them have no adequate enforcement at all.
We must overcome barriers to collaboration and provide some freedom to innovate, improving processes and regulations to make rewilding possible.
The future of our vital ocean depends on what we do in the next few years.
There is a huge potential to achieve something amazing, bringing the life back to oceans as it used to be.
All of this is doable. We must just get together and make it happen.
Let's all work together in partnership to restore the marine environment.
This is a wonderful opportunity for practitioners, regulators and funders to come together, to raise our collective ambition and rewild the sea.
I'm Ben Goldsmith. I'm chair of the Conservative Environment Network. I'm also a non-executive director of Defra, and you'll be hearing from our Secretary of State, George Eustice, in a minute. And I'm hugely honored to be invited to participate in this conference. Charles's book, The End of the Line, had a massive impact on me when it was published 10 or 11 years ago, and the film subsequently. And since then, I've been a huge fan of his, but also of the little organization he founded with others, the Blue Marine Foundation. I've been blown away by the achievements of that organization, both here at home, but also in our huge overseas territories and elsewhere in the world, establishing highly protected areas, and in effect, bringing about this whole discussion, putting it into action. It's hard to ignore the depletion of the natural fabric of our world that has taken place all around us. In my lifetime, I've been a passionate lover of nature, and I have become fundamentally quite despondent about the loss of life all around. And that's why I'm an environmentalist, and I guess that's why each of the people on this conference is attending today. And I think during the COVID lockdown, I think we realized more than ever how important it is in our lives to have healthy, diverse, abundant nature. Viral clips of dolphins swimming in the harbor at Trieste and wild boar with their babies trotting through the deserted streets of Berlin have all gone viral. And I think that there's a great awakening taking place right now amongst a much wider proportion of the population than has ever happened before. I think this recovery is going to be a different one to those that have gone before. I think nature restoration is going to be at its heart, not just here, but everywhere. So I'm feeling optimistic on that basis. And I just want to read you something. Another book that had a huge impact on me was George Monbiot's book, Feral, which I think awakened in many people the idea of rewilding as a pathway to nature restoration. And he quoted a guy called Oliver Goldsmith, no relation of mine, I don't think, who in 1776 described the arrival of the herring as seen from the British shore. And this is how George quoted it in his book. The fish, he recorded, were divided into distinct columns of 5 or 6 miles in length and 3 or 4 broad, while the water before them curls up as if forced out of its bed. The whole water seems alive and is seen so black with fish to a great distance that the number seems inexhaustible. The herring were followed by massive cod, spurdog, tope, and smoothhound, longfin and bluefin tuna, blue, porbeagle, thresher, mako, and occasional great white sharks. Moving in behind, within sight of the British shore, it's almost unimaginable today, were pods of fin whales and sperm whales. This astonishing congregation of life has all but gone, largely through overfishing. So I think the relevance of this conference is that rewilding offers us a pathway to restoring some of that abundance for the benefit of everyone. And also it offers us a way to enable the sea to play its part in helping us solve the climate crisis. There's a brilliant article in the Times this morning by Craig Bennett, the new chief executive of the Wildlife Trusts, which points to the fact that nature really is able to help us if only we'll allow it to. We've been lucky enough to have a string in recent years of secretaries of state in Defra who really want to change things. The agriculture bill, I think, is the greatest triumph for nature that we've ever seen in this country. The environment bill, I think, will lay down the best environmental framework of perhaps any country on earth, maybe Costa Rica, Bhutan, certainly puts us up there in the big league. If we get it right, the fisheries bill has similar potential. Richard Benyon's just completed this review calling for a new highly protected areas in our sea. And George Eustice, our Secretary of State now, who's about to speak to you, I think is he's just the man for the job. So George, no pressure.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. And it's a real pleasure to follow Ben in this conference. This is an agenda that I know he's absolutely passionate about. We've discussed it many times. And as he said, if you go back to the 19th century, there was indeed a view among policymakers that our marine resources were, as they described it, inexhaustible. And we discovered during the 20th century that wasn't the case. Fisheries stocks came under pressure. In fact, they had a very short respite during the Second World War before continuing their downward trajectory, and we've had to try all sorts of management measures to ensure that they recover. And I think, as Charles said in his opening remarks, this is a timely conference for a number of reasons. I've got 3 reasons as well, one of them the same as his, 2 slightly different. I think the first is, from my point of view, that our scientific understanding of this area is developing all the time. As one of your packages showed earlier in this conference, there's a growing recognition that our oceans, if managed properly and if left to recover, can have a very important role as a carbon sink. Now, the extent to which they can do that is a subject of debate, but I think it's increasingly recognized that enabling our oceans to rewild and to recover has got a very important role to play in carbon sequestration. The second reason, though, that it's very timely is that the UK will be hosting COP26, now delayed, of course, to next year. But we've been very clear that we want biodiversity and the role of nature in addressing climate change to be a major part of that agenda. And I think that links to the theme of this conference as well, because we also know that left alone to recover, you get an abundance of life in these areas that are properly protected. And not only does that have a role in climate change and in carbon sequestration, but it also, of course, has a very, very important role for the abundance of life and biodiversity. Which links me to a further point. And I know later today you'll be hearing from Richard Benyon. As you will all know, Richard has just completed a report for us on highly protected marine areas. I'm sure you've all read it since you're interested in this. For those that haven't, I very much commend it. It's a very powerful, very cogent report that describes the benefits of leaving areas alone, fully protecting them to enable them to fully recover. And it points out quite powerfully that if you do that, you do get an abundance of life, and you also get spillover effects to areas outside the protected area. And in some cases, more fish available for fishing communities outside the area that's been protected. And my final point in this area is the one that overlaps with something that Charles said, and that is that now that we've left the European Union and we have a number of important flagship bills going through, we do have an opportunity to do things differently. And I think there's been a tendency in the last few years for people to say, well, the Common Agricultural Policy, that was a bit of a basket case. We can obviously do far better on that if we had our own domestic policy. There are a few people who would defend the common fisheries policy, and it's widely understood that we can do better on that front. There's been a tendency, though, to think that on the environment front, the emphasis should be on rolling over and keeping things the same and retaining the approach that the European Union took. And my view is we should challenge that thinking and challenge whether that's truly right. My critique of the European Union during that referendum campaign was that often there's too much emphasis on drawing lines on maps, but nowhere near enough emphasis on the management measures that you need to actually get a recovery in nature. Often too many lawyers and not enough scientists, and sometimes too much reporting and not enough action. And we've got a great opportunity now, having left the European Union through our new flagship Environment Bill, to really think differently and to think much more creatively about how we can deliver for our environment, including our marine environment. And my final point, of course, is that in the context of fisheries policy, of course, in return for granting continued access to other EU countries, we would want a rebalancing of sharing arrangements on fish stocks. But as our white paper 2 years ago made absolutely clear, it is also the case that we will be requiring sustainable fishing activity as the quid pro quo for any vessel, whether a UK or foreign vessel seeking access to our waters. And once we regain control of our exclusive economic zone, it gives us much greater power to decide how we manage marine protected areas that are within our EEZ. So this is a very exciting time. I know that you'll be hearing from Richard Benyon later. I should say that his report is in some ways unfinished business, since as some of you will know, Richard was my immediate predecessor as Fisheries Minister. And when marine conservation zones were first discussed, there was the concept of what were then called reference sites, which hadn't quite got right by that stage. It was recommended that they be revisited at some point in the future. Politics being the way it is, that point took some 6 years before it arrived, but it's very fitting that Richard completed that work and finished that very powerful report, and I'm sure we all look forward to hearing from him later. So thank you again for inviting me to address your conference. It looks like an exciting agenda that you have for today, and I hope it goes well.
Just click once, just leave.
Yep. Hello, I'm Isabella Tree, and with my husband Charlie Burrell, we run a rewilding project in West Sussex on the Knepp estate. And I'm also author of a book called Wilding, which describes our story of how we went from intensive arable and dairy agriculture to a rewilding project, which I think has perhaps some lessons or resonances with Rewilding the Sea. I'm just going to move to my so this is what our land looks like now. And when people come and see it, they find it very difficult to describe because there's absolutely nothing like it in our landscape in Britain today. People liken it to the Masai Mara or sometimes the Okavango Delta in Africa. And certainly it's something that neither Charlie or I felt that we could ever have on our own land, that it could ever turn into this. Next slide, please. And so this is what our land looked like 20 years ago. Sorry, previous slide. That's it. This is what our land looked like 20 years ago when we were arable and dairy farming. In the 17 years that we were farming like this, we rarely made a profit. We're on very, very heavy clay, and it's just land that's not suitable for intensive modern farming. We just couldn't ever be competitive. The idea of rewilding came from Franz Vera, a Dutch ecologist in Europe, whose work is really transforming the way we think about nature restoration. Key to restoring natural systems, Franz says, is to kickstart the dynamism in the process again, allow nature the space and the time to breathe and let it restore itself. And so that means standing back as human beings and allowing nature to perform. Next slide, please. So for us, that meant restoring natural river systems, restoring our floodplains and our natural hydrology, and also introducing free-roaming animals. So the way these animals, the herbivores, the large megafauna that would have been in our landscapes in the past, the way they interact with vegetation, the way they disturb the soil, their dung, their urine, the way they transport seeds, everything they do has a kick-on effect, a sort of trophic effect, if you like, that stimulates biodiversity and creates a sort of kaleidoscopic range of habitats. And then we stood back and just waited to see what happened. So no goals, no targets, just simply allowing nature to take its course. It was a bold decision, but it wasn't one I can take credit for. It was really Charlie, my husband. He realized that what we were doing to our land was getting us nowhere. It was never going to be financially viable. We had to think of something else to do with the land, preferably something that would work with the land rather than battling against it all the time. And that's when we decided to do a nature conservation project, which really appealed to us both, but it didn't appeal to everybody. Next slide, please. So giving up farming literally went against the grain for most people, for our neighbors, even for Charlie's family, who also had farming in their DNA. People wrote furious letters to us, to the press, to Defra, trying to stop the project. I think they saw it really as an affront to how they had seen the landscape being managed before. It was an aesthetic judgment as much as anything else, a picture they had in their heads of what the English countryside should look like. And what we were doing looked like we were leaving something to be messy, uncared for, and that we were being very irresponsible about it. It's also very different to conventional nature conservation, which is all about close human management, which often involves an enormous amount of time, effort, and money. And that was clearly something that we weren't doing. Often criticism came from people who thought they knew the countryside and would call themselves nature lovers, but actually when we went to meetings and parish council meetings and presentations that we gave about NEP, their knowledge base was actually very low. So they might bemoan the lack of hedgehogs in the landscape, but they never really seriously questioned why that might be. And they certainly weren't aware of the fact that Britain is one of the most depleted countries in the world, or the catastrophic declines that we've seen over the last 50 to 70 years, which was exactly what Charlie and I were like. We used to travel the world to look at wonderful wildlife. We never once thought that we could and should have it in our own backyard. Often the naysayers too were conservationists. They understood the declines and the depletions, but what they felt was they needed to have computer modeling, environmental impact studies, endless reports and goals and targets, ways of measuring what might happen. And of course, rewilding isn't about that at all. It's really about recognizing that we don't know the first thing really about how nature can rebound, about how novel ecosystems can kick off again. It's really about standing back and letting nature teach us, letting the results speak for themselves. Nothing we could have done, nothing we could have put into a computer at the very beginning of our project could have explained or predicted or shown what has happened to NEP today. Next slide, please. If you go out into the scrubland now, the sound of the bird song is so loud, you literally feel it reverberating in your lungs. We had a survey last year, a breeding bird survey, that showed that the density of our songbirds is probably higher at NEP than probably anywhere else in the UK. But it's also the rarity of species here that's astonishing. We've now got some of the most critically endangered species in the UK. We've got nightingales, turtle doves, purple emperor butterflies. We've got peregrine falcons nesting in a tree. We've got all 5 UK owls. We've got 13 out of the 18 UK bats. All of these species have found us because the natural resources and the habitat is there for them. They've come here spontaneously. But it's not simply about the wildlife. What we've discovered is that biodiversity is really an expression of even greater things happening in the natural ecosystem. So we are now producing this new buzzword, ecosystem services. We know that the water, that the polluted water that comes onto our land from farms around us is being cleaned by the restored soils and the vegetation on NEP. We're also holding back water in times of flood because the land is now acting as a sponge. And we've also restored our soils. So we've doubled the carbon content in the soils. That means we've gone from being a net carbon emitter to being a really significant carbon sink. We're pulling carbon back into our improved wetlands, into the soil, into the vegetation and the growing trees. But perhaps most exciting of all is that gradually opposition to the project has fallen away. The doomsday scenarios of ragwork covering our land has disappeared. No one's been attacked by a longhorn cow. And I think after the initial shock of seeing this rapid transformation into thorny scrub and exuberant dynamic landscape, people's aesthetics have begun to change. We've even had letters of apology. One woman who wrote to us early on in the project who said that we turned a beautiful landscape into an abomination, actually wrote and apologized and said that she was sorry she'd said that because she now realizes that NEP is beautiful, but in a very different way. Our mailbag now is very different. We have emails, social media, messages, letters, gifts, books from people who have been here and who have been really profoundly moved by the experience. And I think that's the power of NEP. It's not just theory on paper, it's rewilding in action. So you can hear it, you can see it, you can smell it. And that's really encouraging because when you come here, it changes your baseline. It can actually reverse the baseline for the better. So you become greedier for more. When you go back to landscapes that in the past you feel nostalgically attached to or emotionally bound to, you notice now what isn't there. You can hear the silence. You can appreciate that the life is missing and you want it back. Hundreds of farmers and landowners now come to NEP to see if they can recreate something like this on their land. Already there are rewilding projects kicking off across Britain with tens of thousands of hectares. And some farmers will be doing entirely rewilding and some will be doing partly. But there is a move now, thanks to being able to actually see what can happen, that it's a reality that has kicked the whole thing off. The very presence of NEP has a kind of spillover effect, I think. We've become a biodiversity hotspot. So as species spill out into the wider countryside, that is, I think, kicking off, expanding people's imaginations. We're now part of a farming cluster. 40 farmers have joined our farm cluster. And they're all looking seriously at ways that they can increase wildlife on their land. They may not be going the whole hog down the rewilding route, or maybe they're just at the beginning of a journey like we were 20 years ago. But it's something we couldn't even imagine 20 years ago. It really has changed the entire landscape, I think, around us. We know the crisis we're facing. We know the time to do something is now. What NEP and other rewilding projects like it have shown, I think, is the value of committing oneself to an idea and allowing the results to speak for themselves. It gives people hope above all. It galvanizes people. So often we feel trapped by being disempowered in the face of these incredible crises we're facing. But when you see nature rebounding like this and you see how much is possible, then that really galvanizes people into action. And it's all about doing rather than just talking about doing. So the key, I think, is to literally take the plunge and allow rewilding to speak for itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What a fantastic presentation, Isabella, and very inspirational. So what does this mean within the context of ocean systems? What I want to do in the next few minutes is to really try and introduce the concept of rewilding in the sea and relate it to something which is very similar in view, which is the idea of marine wilderness. So if we look back in time, or if you were to Google the idea of marine wilderness, then you wouldn't find much in the way of ocean pictures. This is the sort of thing that's returned when you put the word wilderness into Google, and it shows trackless forests, icy wastes, or unforgiving mountains. There are hardly any images of the ocean. And that's probably because we don't readily associate the idea of wilderness with the sea, and it's hard to pin down what we mean by wilderness in the sea. Next slide, please. When we think of wild oceans, it is usually the physical presence of the sea which strikes us most vividly. Could you change the next slide, please, Paul? Can you hear me, Paul?
Yes, apologies, Callum. I think it might be an issue on your end. Are you after a monstrous fish?
No, I'm after the physical present, but stay on the monstrous fish. That's perfect. So the physical presence of the ocean is what strikes us most vividly when we think of wild in the sea. But if we look back, there's something missing. There's in the past, the sea was full of mystery and big wildlife, and for us, fear. And over time, gradually, that fear has diminished as the big wildlife has diminished largely, but also as we learn more about the ocean and how it works. Next slide, please. One of the things about change in the ocean is that what we've seen progressively happen over time is that fishing particularly, but hunting as well, has altered the very nature of the oceans. And so in the past, we found that ocean ecosystems contain many large-bodied animals, giant cod, cetaceans, bluefin tuna, for example, and the habitats themselves on the seabed were three-dimensionally complex and highly diverse. As time has gone on, we've gradually reduced the abundance of many of these big things, and in the course of doing so, our means of fishing have become more intensive, more invasive, more efficient, but more destructive as well. And so what has happened is that progressively, the sea has lost its wildlife, its complexity. And what predominates today over large areas of the ocean is habitats made up of shifting sands and gravels, for example, but also a lot of small-bodied species. So the species that can cope with these high levels of extraction tend to live fast, they reproduce prolifically, and they die young. And they're the ones whose productivity is able to sustain fisheries today, largely speaking. The big stuff has somewhat gone. Next slide, please. So when we think about wilderness in the oceans, it is always in the context of loss. This is a study that was published just a few years ago showing the amount of the world's ocean wilderness. And this is shown in the dark and the pale blue, and the rest of the sea is not wilderness. And what this study says is that we have just 13% left, that it needs a high level of protection to avoid further losses. But what you can see here is that these are not unimpacted, pristine areas which have managed to somehow miraculously escape human impact over the course of the centuries. These are actually places which are little used for various reasons. If you look at Antarctica and the Arctic, for example, these are areas that were intensively exploited for a century or more by the industrial whaling fleets. The sealers came into these places and they killed vast quantities of wildlife. So they're not places that are pristine in that sense, but they are places where nature is in charge. Next slide, please. So what I think that this says really is not that oceans are on a trajectory of loss forever, and the only thing that we can try and do is to stem those losses.
but actually it's a more empowering message, and that is that we can turn around the state of the sea. We can rewild them. We can put nature back in charge. And so where wilderness exists is up to us, really. We are able to create wilderness wherever the opportunity exists to withdraw some of the human impact on the sea. And by rewilding, what we mean is that we can leave nature to get on with it and recover on its own, or we can lend a helping hand. And so any action which is really directed towards improving ocean health in the way that Isabella showed on Land for NEP is a way of generating positive change in the ocean. Next slide, please. Some creatures, of course, have been driven down to such low levels that they will need a helping hand to come back. And so this is a set of stamps published by the Royal Mail a few years ago, which shows some of the endangered wildlife in UK seas. And at least a couple of these species will need active reintroductions in order to help them come back. The sturgeon and the common skate have been essentially eliminated from large areas of their former ranges. And so when we create areas where there are safe havens for them, we can reintroduce them, just as storks, for example, have been reintroduced into the NEP estate. Next slide, please. Likewise, there are some habitats that have also been severely damaged by human activity over time. And one of the foremost among them is oyster reefs. And we'll hear more about those after the break from Philine to Ermgassen. And what these habitats have seen is such a level of destructive impact that there's essentially nothing left, or it's been so degraded that, that the habitat is unable to recover on its own. And that's where we also need to lend a hand and employ active restoration. Next slide, please. So when we think about this, trajectory of fishing down marine ecosystems, the way we can reframe this is as protection up marine ecosystems. And so the putting back of the wildlife happens in the reverse sequence almost of the depletion in the past. And so now it's on the right-hand side of this diagram, and the future is on the left. I think we can really push things back. We can get the seas rewilded. And if we look at the performance of marine protected areas around the world, what you can see is that it's the higher levels of protection which are really delivering the big impacts in terms of recovery of marine life and habitats. And so once you get up to this kind of sense of high levels of protection, so for example, Lyme Bay has lost the dredgers and the trawlers that used to disrupt marine habitats, and now it's much more gently exploited than it was in the past. And when you create areas fully off limits to exploitation, then you're producing some fantastic benefits. Next slide, please. So I think in the context of rewilding really sits at these upper levels. Now I should just give you one point on terminology. Highly protected marine reserves and fully protected marine reserves. Fully protected really is equivalent to what we're calling in the UK highly protected marine areas. And the highly protected from other parts of the world is all about areas which are a little bit less protected, but still strongly protected from sources of damage and harm. Next slide, please. So I think the final message here is really that rewilding is not a luxury. It's not a niche interest for a small number of people. It's an absolute essential to rebuilding the ecological processes and services that they provide to humanity. And so, for example, when we're thinking about ocean ecosystems, rewilding is a way of building up their capacity to clean the water to produce a healthy ecological balance. It's a way of promoting the uptake and storage of carbon. It's a way of protecting vulnerable coasts from storms and rising seas. And it's a way of providing resilience and adaptive capacity to cope with the changes that lie ahead. So rewilding is an essential for all of us. It's not something which we should think of as being something to do only where there is a little bit of space left from other activities. This should predominate in the sea. Thank you.
I would like to thank everybody for their contributions so far this morning. My name's Simon Leadbetter, and I have the honour of basically chairing the Q&A session. We've had some really powerful and inspirational thoughts there with some incredible film. Hopefully what that's done is triggered some thoughts. I can see questions already coming in the Q&A section. So if you have any questions, while the panelists now are turning their video on, staying mute until we direct a question at them, you'll see the Q&A panel at the bottom. So you put a Q&A, put your question there. I've got a series of safe questions that we have pre-scripted, but I'm very happy to ask the ones from the audience as we upvote those. It's just worth mentioning as well that there is a lot of activity on YouTube. This is being live streamed, so that's going on really well. They've got a family watching that. But also, if you want to get involved in the debate, we have Blue's Twitter, @BlueMarineF, @BlueMarineF, with the hashtag Rewilding the Sea. So just to start with our first question, if I could direct this one at Callum. So if you come off mute when it comes to you, could a well-managed fishery create rewilding benefits, possibly more extensive and longer lasting ones than in a protected area, many of which have been recently shown to be dysfunctional?
So the answer is that yes, fisheries management, good fisheries management, is a major part of rewilding, because what that intends to do is to rebuild stocks to healthy, productive levels, and many of our fish stocks are not there yet. But the fact that some protected areas are dysfunctional doesn't mean that protected areas don't have a big role to play in rewilding. And I think that the important things that we can do is to learn from why those protected areas are not functioning properly and how to make them better. When we do it right, when we give areas high levels of protection and we manage them well, we resource them properly, we can see some fantastic recovery taking place. And I think there are many surprises and unexpected paths taken in that recovery, which we wouldn't see in the case of directed management. So protected areas alongside good fisheries management are essential components of rewilding. Thank you.
Fantastic, Callum. That's fantastic. So for Izzy, if I can call you Izzy, how long in total has the journey at NEP been, and is the project still developing rapidly? Do you think this recovery of biodiversity could be transferable to the seas, the blue marine environment?
Well, we started the idea about 20 years ago, but we obviously we weren't brave enough to commit all 3,500 acres to rewilding in one go. It was a bit of a journey, and we've grown as we've gone along that journey. So really, it's between 20 to 15 years, and that's the astonishing and powerful thing, I think, that nobody could have expected, is how nature has come back so fast. If you think of the depleted baseline we were starting at, which was very depleted soils and very few species of any note at all. How that can relate to the sea, I'm not a specialist in the sea, but what I think our lesson has been is that just not expecting outcomes, not predicting, not setting goals and targets has been hugely freeing, and that then you see what will spontaneously come back on its own.
Fantastic, thanks, Izzy. We've got a question that's actually proving to be very popular on the Q&A. So if you go to the Q&A, do put your questions there and do vote the ones up that you really like seeing. This one for the Secretary of State. How do we, so all the people in the audience here, both on YouTube and on Zoom, a collection of public sector bodies, NGOs and others, change the behaviour of significant blockers to marine recovery rewilding progress? Specifically, how do we control behaviours of sectors that have historically acclimatised to a lack of regulation? If you come off mute.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I can't think who they're referring to there, but we obviously, I think it's linked really to the first point, the very first question you had, which is you have to recognise that the marine protected areas that we've had so far to date have really been explicitly about protecting features that are already there. And I think what's very different about a highly protected marine area and the whole theme of your conference is it's not just about protecting a feature that's there. It's about setting in place the circumstances to have a rejuvenation and a new abundance that's not just protecting what's there, but creating the conditions for things to improve and to dramatically improve over time. And I think that is a cultural change from all of the protected designations we've had in the past, whether our domestic MCZs or SACs and so on, and what Richard Benyon has described with the highly protected marine areas and what the presentations that you had described. So I actually think it's not really about enforcement on fisheries. Yes, we have enforcement, we have quota systems, we have marine protection vessels that check on everything. And we have quite sophisticated ways now to make sure that people aren't fishing, for instance, in a protected area where they shouldn't be. But I think it's less about the enforcement, in my view, more about a cultural change that's required in the nature of the protected site that we have.
Excellent. As I have you, George, I'll just throw another question at you. Secretary of State, is now that the government has said that the public owns the right to fish, as it did this week, when will quotas be reformed so that fishing opportunities are more equal and boats using more environmental methods will be favoured?
Well, we'll be passing a fisheries bill. It's going through the House of Lords now. We expect that it'll be in place by the end of this year. And our white paper set out quite clearly what we intend to do in terms of future fisheries management. And that is that short term, in order to maintain some stability in the system, existing FQA units will remain for existing fishing opportunities. But we've explicitly said that any new fishing opportunities that come as a result of our departure and the removal of relative stability and a different approach to quota sharing, that quota will be allocated on a different method. And we floated a number of suggestions. It could include putting a significant increase in quota into the inshore pool. And some people argue that smaller inshore vessels are more sustainable. There are counter arguments in that they're not always more sustainable because they're in a mixed fishery. But nevertheless, we're likely to try to increase the amount of fish available to those smaller vessels that sometimes have lower impacts. And we also float the idea of, potentially licensing additional packages of quota to producer organizations, but judging them on their approach to and their compliance with sustainable fishing, so that it doesn't just become a quota that's doled out along the lines of so-called FQA units, fixed quota allocations. It becomes something that is tendered for periodically. It's an opportunity that can be tendered for and judged against environmental compliance of the vessels that are in a particular producer organization. So there are many exciting ways that we can allocate quota differently once we're outside of the European Union or once the transition period ends. But I should just to stress, we won't be doing things overnight, simply because there needs to be a degree of stability left in the system.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. Right, we're getting a lot of questions in now. I'm afraid we're not going to have time to ask them all, but there's some really popular ones coming in. So this from Jenny Oates from Blue Ventures. Several of the speakers have mentioned the need to let nature take its course with no goals or targets and less reporting. How can we reconcile this approach with conservation funders who often require indicators and measures to show the impact of their funding? Who would like to take that? Callum, Isabella, Ben, Callum?
I think that's one of the conundrums that you face with funders who are target driven, and people often say we have to have objectives for a protected area, and so they set out a load of detail on what needs to come back by when, but nature doesn't comply with those sorts of things. So actually what's better to measure is how successful we are in withdrawing human impacts from these ecosystems, and then see what happens in the way of nature. And what we do know is that we will get more complexity, we will get more diversity, we'll get more large-bodied species, we'll provide hotspots of wildlife. All of those things that you've seen in NEP will be replicated. And so those are kind of more general targets that you can go for, rather than specifying that you need X number of oysters per meter squared of Y square kilometer of oyster reef. I think that's the approach to take.
Fantastic. Thanks for taking that, Callum. I'm going to do one more question and then a quick round robin of those who are on the panel, and then we'll go to the coffee break. So Isabella, you emphasise that one aspect of rewilding is reintroduction, but how relevant is that to marine rewilding? I would see that there are very few species and possibly even fewer habitats that can be reintroduced. So possibly for both Isabella and the others, the most successful measure in my view is to take off relevant damaging pressures and let nature take its course in the sea. The introduction of artificial habitats can be beneficial for some species and is another topic for discussion. So who would like to take that one? Rewilding is about reintroduction, but how relevant is that to marine rewilding? Possibly put you on the spot, Izzy, but that might be for one of the others.
I think it's probably more appropriate for Callum, perhaps.
Fine, Callum.
Well, I think it is appropriate, and there are robust animals that can be reintroduced in the sea. But if we reintroduce, for example, the common skate into areas where we're still bottom trawling, then it won't be successful. What we have to do is to create the conditions where they can persist and survive. And so the establishment of an umbrella of protection is necessary to enable us to slip in these species and get them reestablished. And one of the things that actually is a very intriguing idea is to incorporate, for example, the offshore wind industry and those sorts of reintroductions, because many of these wind farms are off limits to mobile fishing gears in a de facto sense. And so they would provide ideal focuses for reintroduction of big animals like skates.
Thank you very much. Right, we're going to be going to a coffee break very soon. We've got tons of really good questions, so we are gathering all these and we will look to get answers to all of them. But I just want to go a quick round one before we do go to that coffee break. Is really, it's a simple question, probably a simple one-word answer or slightly longer. But to Ben, you started your talk a little bit with how you felt about things. Do you feel optimistic about where we are? Because you said at the beginning that you felt a little bit.
I'm a natural optimist. I don't see the point of being anything other than an optimist. And I do think that there's a sea change in public attitudes right now. And if you look at some of the stuff that our own government is doing, it's really big. And you think of the kind of relatively tokenistic gestures towards nature restoration that we've seen in the past, you know, a few million quid at the end of a budget announcement for reforestation or some such. And suddenly we have some really, really big, meaty, step change pieces of legislation and announcements coming through. So I think we're at a tipping point, or at least we bloody well better be, otherwise we're in big trouble.
So the same question, or if you want to take a slightly different take, is optimism or the balance between doing something and doing nothing? Callum, you can choose which one of those you want to answer. Optimism is a simple yes, no. Balance, doing something, not doing something.
Well, as the singer Joan Baez said, action is the antidote to despair. And I think that is what we need to do, is to take action now.
Thank you very much, Callum. I'm not sure it's politic to ask a Secretary of State if he feels optimistic or not, but generally from your perspective?
Yes, Secretaries of State are always optimistic. They have to be to do this particular job. My only part of reflection, I think it's a very important point around targets. And targets are important so that we can judge progress. But increasingly, my view is we should be looking at trends so that we don't have, you know, fixed numeric targets that everyone says must be hit by 2024, and then you get a bad winter or something and it doesn't happen in that year. Much more important, as we're doing in our reporting at the moment on the 25-year environment plan, is to report on the trend and to just keep all of the trends moving in a positive direction. And that should be our guiding principle on these things.
Fantastic. I've got that question to Izzy, and then I've got one more question from the floor that's getting a lot of voting. Izzy, optimistic? You're the one who's really done this over the last few decades. Are you optimistic that we're going to do this?
I think incredibly optimistic, and I think the more rewilding projects we can establish as soon as possible on land and sea, the more we'll start seeing the results, and the more that will drive the optimism even further. The doing of the thing will take over. So yeah, I'm very optimistic.
Fantastic. My final question, then we will go to that coffee break, because I'm sure you all need one, is from Alistair Sinclair. This is for Callum. Here in Scotland, we currently work under a regime of regulator capture. How do we change the mindset and preferences of Fergus Ewing and the Scottish Government with a view to securing fair management with our inshore waters, in the knowledge that all meaningful fish stocks have flatlined?
Good question.
What it was.
I don't have a good answer other than that persistence pays and good science pays. So we can see a gradual shift in people's attitudes. The very fact that George Eustice, the Secretary of State, is with us today discussing Rewilding the Sea, I think is a positive reflection of how rewilding is coming of age, and how managing the seas differently is being taken very seriously right now. And I think gradually the message will get through, even to people who have been very resistant to those messages in the past. And I think the good news is that rewilding can be beneficial both to exploiters and the exploited, and that we can live in balance there.
Fantastic, thank you for that. So on behalf of Blue and DP World, our sponsor, I'd like to thank all of our morning panelists for the contributions. That's been fantastic. We have lots of questions we haven't had time to answer. We never have enough time for the Q&A. We will collect all those questions and we'll look at how we can answer those over the activity that's going to follow this event. Just to let you know, we have over 420 people either in the Zoom or watching on our live YouTube stream. That means many hundreds of other people will get the content that we produce. We're going to take a short coffee break now. So please be back at your screens at just 11:05, so we've got 4 minutes. And we're going to talk about the opportunities and challenges of rewilding the UK seas. It's fair to say it's best to just leave your Zoom on, leave the live broadcast on, and come back to you, and we will start with the next panel, as I say, at, actually looking at the time, 11:06. So we have 4 minutes. I look forward to seeing you. Thank you to all our panelists.
Hello again, everybody. We're about to get started. Please take your seats, pick up your coffee cups and maybe your mice with the other hand. I'm delighted we had such great questions at the last session, and also that the Secretary of State could stay to answer some of them. So thank you very much, George, for that. Now we're going to hear from Richard Benyon, who, as you probably all know, served as Natural Environment and Fisheries Minister for 3 years. And after that was the MP with the most consistent sense of humour and interest in fisheries and conservation. He was commissioned by the then Environment Secretary, Michael Gove, to conduct a review into whether or not England does need highly protected marine areas. That review has just been published, and Richard is going to address us on the provocative title of "Can the Sea Rewild Itself?" Richard, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles. I hope I'm visible to you. Hello. Thank you, Charles. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this fantastic conference, really inspiring. On World Oceans Day last year, one of George's predecessor but one, Michael Gove, commissioned this review, and we published on Oceans Day, World Oceans Day this year. And it's been a really fascinating experience working with some wonderful people, a great team from Defra and agencies, building on evidence from all around the world. And this is our chance now to do something really meaningful in our seas here. And we were asking what is missing from how we protect our seas now. And we looked at what highly protected marine areas are. So can I have the first slide, please? I was ably assisted by a fantastic team. You can see we had a leader in ocean industries, we had a fisherman, we had a leader of marine wildlife trusts, we had two world-renowned academic scientists and an environmental economist from Cambridge and a marine wind energy leader. And it was, and of course, a defunct politician as well. And it was a wonderful team who looked and took a very balanced view at how we were going to do this. The first thing we did was look at what a highly protected marine area is. Can I have the next slide, please? We concluded these are areas that allow the protection and recovery of marine ecosystems. They prohibit extractive, destructive, and depositional uses and allow only non-damaging levels of other activities. It's really important we get that definition right and how it differentiates from marine protected areas. Marine protected areas are designed to protect specific features or specific species. And very often a reef or a particular area on the benthic area of the seas, sometimes it will be for other reasons. But the most important thing about what highly protected marine areas are that they have a whole site approach. And we never in the last year, I don't think ever used the word rewilding. But of course, that is what we are talking about. We're talking about the exclusion of man's activities, destructive activities, and the chance for nature to recover. And that's really what we were talking about. I'm not going to have time or your attention to go through all of our recommendations, but I just want to highlight some of them. We do think that there need to be clear conservation objectives, but I think the previous speakers have made the point that if we get too hidebound in trying to follow to the last letter key targets, then we're not really understanding how nature works. And so I think that there needs to be a common sense approach. I've spoken about the whole site approach. So it's the whole water column, it's the seabed, it's under the seabed as well that we're talking about protecting. And that is a key differentiation. I'll talk about the difference that effect has and the evidence we saw from around the world. And I think just in the 6 or 7 years since I was minister at Defra, the world has changed. Ben made the point earlier and others have as well. The public really mind about this. This is really important. It's Blue Planet 2 helped, but it was much wider than that. The whole issue of plastics pollution, about the state of our seas, how this fits into our intentions in terms of net zero and protecting and tackling climate change. So seas public awareness was a key point. And we looked at sites around the United Kingdom, very small ones. They're very small. There's one in Scotland called Lamlash Bay on the Isle of Arran. Inspirational, because the community on the island of Arran have driven this and they police it. It has seen a restoration of that small area of the sea. And in the little postage stamps that we've got around places like Lundy, we've started to see how nature can recover in a relatively short space of time. But key has been for us looking abroad and seeing what is happening on scale. So we also talked about governance, about how government should do this. In the notes for this conference, there were the words which really struck home when it said, the regulatory environment in the United Kingdom does not encourage active marine restoration. The regulatory requirement is, the framework is incredibly complicated. We were dealing with Natural England, Marine Management Organization, the JNCC, Environment Agency, IFCAs, we were talking to CFAS, and then of course there are the other bodies around other parts of the United Kingdom. We were only talking about the English coast. And it is a very confusing, busy environment, the sea. It's got huge importance to us in terms of achieving that net zero and the renewable energy commitment and all the other areas of marine planning, and trying to fit this really vital new element of conservation as part of that is going to be complicated, but we think the government can do it, and we think we've helped them achieve, be able to achieve this. We said that sites should be identified on the principles of ecological importance. Those are naturalness, sensitivity, potential to recover, and as we've also discussed earlier, ecosystem services. A secondary filter to that will be the social and economic principles, and they are key. The Secretary of State mentioned earlier the scars on my back, which were the reference sites, and our failure to deliver them, frankly, after the Marine and Coastal Access Act was implemented. And I think the lesson we learned in this review has been that we've got to engage people, and people mind, and yes, these will have impacts on people's lives. We can minimize those impacts, but we've got to maximize the value for the natural environment. And if you do it in the right way, people will come along. And what we want to see achieved is to hit that sweet spot of rewilding these areas, these extraordinary areas of our seas, and seeing the biomass of larger species, because they've been allowed to continue to a much more productive rate, spilling over into the neighboring areas of the sea and benefiting fishermen and potters and others that will undoubtedly benefit from these hotspots of biodiversity. And we saw this happen abroad. Can I go on to the next slide, please? These are graphs showing the density and the biomass of in European protected sites. And if you go to the next slide, this shows what happens in a marine protected area versus an unprotected area. And you're starting to see extraordinary densities, in these cases of scallops. But if we go to the next slide, this is Cabo Pulmón, Mexico in 1919. And I want you to keep a really close eye on this rock, because the next photograph that I show you will be the same rock 10 years later, the same part of the sea. And there it is. That is the extraordinary ability of nature to recover. We've seen in California, for example, Callum draw our attention to the benefits of this spillover effect, so that a highly protected marine area, of which the local fishing community were extremely dubious when it happened, they are now the greatest supporters because they are benefiting from this biomass pouring into other areas. I will just say a word on enforcement. I think that there's some good news here. We think of enforcement in terms of Royal Navy vessels or IFCAs with their very strapped for cash vessels trying to deal with our enforcement of marine protected areas. Well, technology is helping, and Britain has been a leader in this in terms of how we are protecting our areas of sea in some of the remotest parts of the world. And so satellite and drone technology and other forms of data. And my respect to Greenpeace for how they have been exposing activities in marine protected areas, showing precisely in real time what vessels are doing when they're shooting their nets, when they're towing, when they're moving to another area. And we can tell from data, what vessels are doing. And the Blue's experience in Lyme Bay is absolutely key here. Fishermen get a text in real time when they're going too close to a line. So let's be bogged down by enforcement. Technology can help. I'm running out of time, so I will just finish by saying that, look, our seas have never been under greater threat. We know about climate change, acidification. We know the impact of overexploitation. We're understanding about pollution. We rely on our seas, and this is our time, and this is a way forward, and something that we in Britain, if we want to be still viewed globally as a leader in this, this is our opportunity to do this. This fits in with the government's 25-year environment plan. It fits in with the 30 by 30 commitment to the UN. It fits in with their own marine strategy and the Commonwealth Blue Charter. And of course, the Blue Belt policy that's been so successful. Can we skip 2 slides? I'm running out of time. Next slide, the last slide, that's it. So our seas are very complex areas. There's much more going on in them than most people think. But with proper planning and a real political commitment, we think that what this report offers is a way forward for the government to continue to be a world leader, but also to protect our seas at a time when they most need it. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Philine Ermgassen. I work with the Nature Conservancy, and I also have the pleasure of working with the Native Oyster Restoration Alliance. And I just want to start by saying that all 5 of the habitats that I'm displaying on this slide here are now regularly restored somewhere in the world. And I'm really excited to share with you today some of those restoration successes. In fact, 3 of the pictures here are taken from restored sites that just maybe 2 decades ago would have been mud. And that's in this case, the oyster reef, the seagrass and the mangroves. But as I say, we can find similar cases, particularly with salt marsh, and we're beginning to see that kind of impact on coral reefs as well. So the first example I want to talk you through is from the east coast of the United States. All these slides are courtesy of Bo Lusk, who works with the Nature Conservancy in their Virginia Coast Reserve. And he's been working on these restoration projects for over a decade. And I don't want to dwell on the history too much, but just to illustrate with this map that in these coastal bays, which is circled, historically, there were really abundant seagrasses. And by the late 1990s, there were really only 1 or 2 spots the size of a hand towel. So really small areas remaining. But what the Nature Conservancy and their partners have done in this area developed techniques to restore eelgrass to these bays. It involves volunteers. They go out with snorkels and masks, and they harvest seed pods from eelgrasses, take them back to their facilities, and really take care of those seed pods in these aerated tanks, keep them clean, free of bacteria. And then when they're matured, they take them back out into the water and plant them off boats. And the next map I can show you here are the points are where they've relayed seeds, and the colored areas are where they've subsequently mapped seagrasses. And this time series takes you through from 1998 to 2018. And as you can see, the area that's been reseeded far exceeds the areas they've placed seed because of the knock-on effects, these spill-on effects. And now they're looking at having the largest seagrass restoration in the world in these coastal bays, with over 36 kilometers squared of habitat restored. It's really phenomenal. But it's not just the habitat, it's also the associated communities. That's really why we're trying to restore these habitats. It's not just for the habitats themselves, it's also for those associated communities. And they're seeing seagrass species come back into the bays. Bay scallops were the interest of a very large fishery in the 1930s, which in fact contributed to the decline in seagrasses in the bay. It's quite destructive to harvest. But now that the seagrasses are back, they're able to reintroduce from hatcheries bay scallops into the bay. And these are some of the babies being released. They're not yet at the point where they can open these up to fisheries. They're still really below those levels, but they're working towards being able to open some of these areas for recreational harvest in coming years, and just to provide more of that connection between land and the sea for these coastal communities. The next example I want to tell you about is from the other side of the world and a completely different habitat type. This is also work that's led by the Nature Conservancy with their partners. And this is from Victoria, Australia, in Port Phillip Bay, which is the bay on which Melbourne City sits. Again, historically, there were oyster reefs and mussel beds in the bay. And while they're restoring both of these, I'm going to briefly talk you through what it takes to restore at large scales oyster reefs in these bays. This is the native oyster, Ermgassen, and the restoration that's taking place there now involves really large scale industrial methods. 180 tons of limestone rock per reef are pushed out by tugboats on 26 meter long barges. They're taken to the restoration locations where that rock is then offloaded. At the moment, they've restored 2.5 hectares of oyster and mussel beds in this bay, but they're aiming to get 20 hectares by 2026. They're scaling up all the time. Those limestone reefs are often then also subsequently seeded with shells. There might also be plots just with shell. These are shells from the seafood industry, which are relayed, and then living adult oysters are relayed on top of that as brood stock. And they've seen really good success with these, over 80% survival. They've seen growth. They've seen recruitment on these structures laid out just starting in 2017. And they've already seen really large schools, thousands of snappers, unprecedented, according to the fisheries managers, and other charismatic species visiting the site. But this kind of restoration isn't just taking place at the other side of the world. There's increasing interest in oyster reef restoration around Europe. And I just want to talk to you about one project from the many that are there in Europe at the moment. This is one that's being led by the Germans, specifically by AWI and BFN, taking place in really challenging conditions off the German coast. And this isn't a restoration, so to speak. This is a reintroduction. Oysters in these areas where they're reseeding them in the German coast are completely extinct at the moment. And so therefore, they're having to really start from the ground up. They're scaling up hatchery production. They're having to work out how to produce really large amounts of algae so they can grow those oysters up to sizes suitable for restoration. And on the right-hand side here, you can see the result of having put some of these baby oysters out at depth for just a growing season. So it's looking really phenomenal with these pilot efforts. But even though these pilot efforts are quite small in spatial scale, they're incredibly industrial in their approach, and they have to be because these projects are working at 30 meters depth. And because they're doing really rigorous science, this involves also getting divers down in the dark at 30 meters depth for just a few minutes at a time, basically, to undertake the monitoring. But they've seen really fantastic growth and survival. And they've also seen, as you can see in this image, some of those fantastic associated communities returning to the area. And they're looking now to scale these pilots up. And the long-term goal is to have a sustainable oyster population in these waters. The work in Europe is really fast moving and it's growing in scale all the time. One of the things that I'm really proud to be involved with is the Native Oyster Restoration Alliance, which together with the UK, Ireland Native Oyster Network are really helping support interactions between projects so that we can learn lessons, reduce waste, understand the challenges associated and how other projects have overcome them. We do this through creating physical networks in terms of conferences, through sharing information on Twitter, through updating our websites, and through running working groups that are specifically addressing current barriers to restoration. We're really excited to be launching the historical ecology approaches to getting some more background information as well for outreach, as well as for site selection and decision making. But where restoration is really going in the future, it's not just about scaling up, it's also about thinking at the landscape scale and thinking about multiple habitats together. And so this is just one example, again, from Australia, but from Tasmania, where a kelp restoration project was looking to see what communities associated with that restoration effort. And they found really, really strong recruitment of that native oyster, Ermgassen, underneath the kelp, because of the shading effect of the kelp, essentially reducing turfal algae and letting more oysters settle. So it's really promising to see these kinds of results. But this co-restoration of different habitats isn't new. The Americans have been really ahead of the curve with marine coastal restoration. Oyster reef restoration, for example, has been taking place for over 2 decades in the US. And in here, they really regularly restore multiple habitats together. So the bottom image here is from Mobile Bay, Alabama, where they've been restoring these shallow reefs, oyster reefs, with the intention of also regaining salt marsh behind through reduced wave activity and increased water clarity. And they've been seeing really great results there. In Pensacola Bay, they also have several management plans restoring all 3 habitat types, seagrasses, oyster reefs, and salt marshes in this bay. And I'm excited to be part of a project that's looking to express to decision makers and the public exactly how much those habitats give us in terms of benefits moving forward as we start thinking about how to scale up and where to go. And what our models have shown is that we can get kind of thousands of tons additional fish from these habitats each year. We're also building these into a tool, again, to help decision makers, where they can then select areas of existing habitats. And this is just a dummy, we're launching it later this year, but it will allow them to see how many more fish they're getting from these habitats, or they can put in the area they're restoring and see how much they might expect to get from their restored habitats in the future. So it's really exciting, and we're getting great uptake from many partners. And the reason it's so important to start thinking about where we're going in the long term, not just with multiple habitats, but also with regards to expressing our stories and why we like these, is that not everyone is as fortunate as we are in having a direct connection to the sea and being able to get out there and among the weeds. Many of these habitats are inaccessible. And so developing this science story alongside and then making it accessible to others with numbers that make sense to them, I think is a really critical part of our progress, scaling up and moving forwards. So thank you very much for your time.
Hello, everyone. My name's Dr. Gareth Johnson, and I work for a Danish energy company called Ørsted as a specialist in their strategic environment team. I also manage their R&D program in relation to the environment. I've been asked to speak to you today on behalf of our Vice President for the UK Ørsted, Ben Sykes, who also chairs the Offshore Wind Industry Council. In case you don't know who Ørsted are, we're the largest renewable energy company in the world and the global leader in offshore wind. As of this month, we've installed 1,500 wind turbines globally, and this year we were actually voted the most sustainable company in the world. I was very pleased to be invited to speak today, as I think there's a particular synergy between green energy and the concept of rewilding. My talk will focus on experiences of rewilding from the perspective of the offshore wind sector. I've taken all my examples from Ørsted projects, but I think it's probably only fair to say that other offshore wind developers are also doing similar work. I want to talk to you about where Ørsted has worked collaboratively to build offshore renewable projects, but also deliver enhanced biodiversity. Using these examples, I will then discuss what we've learned relating to challenges and opportunities in this area. So Borssele 1 and 2 is our first wind farm in the Netherlands and is actually still under construction, although it has now started to generate electricity. And I have a short video here explaining the nature inclusive design initiative that we're rolling out at Borssele.
Ørsted is currently building the Borssele 1 and 2 offshore wind farm off the coast of the Netherlands. when completed, the wind farm will have 94 turbines and provide enough power for 1 million Dutch households. The Bossele 1 and 2 wind farm will cover an area of 112 square kilometers, the equivalent of 15,000 football pitches. And inside this area, Ørsted will test a new initiative designed to support biodiversity in the Dutch part of the North Sea. Inside Bossele 1 and 2, Ørsted will install a number of artificial reefs on the seabed to create suitable shelter and feeding grounds for Atlantic cod and other large fish species. The reefs will consist of large concrete pipes installed on the seabed in circular reef formations. Inside these new reef formations, which we call cod pipe reefs, cavities and hiding places will form, where the cod can seek shelter and feed on, for example, smaller fish and crabs. The cod pipe reefs are designed in close cooperation with researchers from Wageningen Marine Research, who will also study the ecological effects of the projects in the years to come, with support from the Rich North Sea programme. Together, this research will contribute to developing knowledge and experience for future nature development projects in wind farms in the North Sea. As fishing is not allowed inside the wind farm, the area can serve as a sanctuary where fish populations can grow and replenish. This can ultimately lead to long-term benefits around the wind farm, including for the fishing in the region. The cod pipe reefs are one of the new initiatives that Ørsted is delivering to protect our marine environment while helping to create a world that runs entirely on green energy.
So as mentioned there, the ongoing monitoring of the reef is being coordinated by the Rich North Sea programme, which is a really successful initiative led by NGOs, but involving academics and industry as well to investigate opportunities for nature enhancement within offshore wind farms in the North Sea. So the next project I want to talk about is Anholt, which is actually Denmark's largest offshore wind farm. And for context here, in Danish waters, there used to be extensive rocky reefs made up of boulders and obviously providing essential habitat for many species. And these have been taken out over the last century in order for the construction industry to use in coastal protection, but also in things like foundations for piers. So as a substrate for wildlife, this is now scarce, and removal of these boulders is strictly prohibited. So what Ørsted did when they constructed Anholt was they actually aggregated 6,000 boulders to create 25 reefs of increased complexity in order to provide habitats for wildlife, shellfish and fish species. We started collecting underwater video footage around 6 months after creation. And what you can see on the images there is colonization by encrusting fauna, and also increases in fish and shellfish. You can see the claws of a lobster actually sticking out in the lower image there. And the scientists from the local Kattegat aquarium were so impressed with how the reefs were performing in terms of providing a structure for wildlife that we're now in conversation with the Danish government and NGOs about extending the scheme, and particularly at looking at how other forms of reef may benefit wildlife within the wind farm array. And lastly, I want to come a bit closer to home. So this is Gunfleet Sands, which is located 7 kilometres off the coast of Essex near Clacton. In this instance, Blue Marine Foundation actually approached Ørsted with an idea for a project in 2017. And we've heard quite a lot about oysters already today. But the context for this was in the mid-20th century, there was a collapse in the European flat oyster populations across Europe. And Blue had the idea that we could house adult oysters within cages inside the array, and that this would help seed the coast of Essex and perhaps restore the reef structures that were here historically. The project took advice from local oystermen, IFCA, conservation bodies, academia and the Crown Estate. And much collective effort was put into a feasibility study, which ultimately raised the risk that the larval settlement on seabed was actually far from certain. So what we're currently doing is, sorry, can you go back a second? Is looking for options to move forward with the project and increase the chance of success. However, aside from the project actually going ahead, we have learned much from the experience about how habitat restoration initiatives might combine with offshore wind rollout, and Ørsted are continuing to explore this and other opportunities actively with Blue Marine Foundation. What this serves to highlight, I think, is that we will need to invest effort in developing restoration concepts in the offshore marine environment due to very few existing exemplars. Also, that knowledge of the precise local conditions will be absolutely critical to any success of a rewilding initiative. So what we can see from these examples is that compared to land, the UK offshore marine environment can be very dynamic and ephemeral. This means that sometimes we don't have the data we need to understand what will and won't work in terms of conservation initiatives. Also, a lack of reliable historic baseline data in many instances means that we do not know precisely what we always want out of conservation efforts. And as discussed today, the recent Benyon review recommended HPMAs in part to help us understand what full recovery of the marine environment might look like. But from what we know on land, this may not always be possible without at least some form of intervention. From an industry perspective, there are also concerns about restoration initiatives occurring within projects. We would need to be able to access infrastructure in order to carry out essential maintenance and any repairs if required. Also, compared to land, we lease the seabed from the Crown Estate, whereas for terrestrial rewilding schemes, you may be dealing with a private landowner, so it might be simpler. And also a consideration for us is what would happen at the end of life were the wind farm to be decommissioned. And something that's unique to the UK, I think, is that our wind farms are mostly open to fishing. And so therefore we do have to consider liability and risk of fishermen snagging their gear on any structures that we put within the wind farm. However, I do think there are some very tangible benefits of working together. The offshore wind sector has a great deal of knowledge and technical expertise in the offshore marine environment. Offshore areas that are developed often have extensive environmental surveys carried out over a number of years. And as such, these areas can often be relatively well known compared to other offshore areas. Many offshore wind farms have technicians visit daily, as well as periodic environmental surveys. And these platforms can be used as opportunities either to establish or monitor any ongoing schemes. From experience, also, many offshore restoration projects require attachment to the seabed, at least initially, to increase the chance of success, and infrastructure can provide this function. And as I've already mentioned, fishing is allowed in most of our wind farms within the UK. However, the simple presence of the infrastructure does provide a physical barrier and then therefore some form of protection to anything that's laid on the seabed. We now know that climate change is one of the greatest threats to biodiversity globally, and the UK were actually the first in the G20 to legislate for net zero emissions by 2050. The UK's wind sector is set to produce 1/3 of the UK's electricity from 2030. And actually earlier this year, Minister Power said in her keynote speech at Coastal Futures that offshore renewable energy will need to be delivered alongside protection of the marine environment and whilst maximising co-benefits. And from our experience, I think we could learn much from what other countries are doing, for example, through the Rich North Sea programme. Also from these experiences, biodiversity enhancement or nature recovery initiatives with industry are most likely to succeed when they are truly collaborative and ambitions can align. Also, that there is a real need to be innovative and flexible in terms of trying things out simply due to the changeable nature of the marine environment compared to the land. I believe there's a genuine opportunity here, however, to deliver twin ambitions of green energy and nature recovery and for us to decarbonise our electricity supply while bringing additional benefits to the marine environment. Thank you.
Hi there, good morning, folks. I'm Roger Proudfoot, hopefully you can hear me. I'm the Environment Agency's Estuary and Coast Planning Manager, I'm here to represent the cross-government body initiative on the restoration of estuarine and coastal habitats, Rememory, restoring meadow, marsh and reef, remembering our seas, how they used to be, and restoring some of the benefits we used to have. I just want to thank Blue Marine for the opportunity to speak at such an important conference, which comes at a time when we all hope there is a turning point in our history to help our marine environment recover. Our group membership is illustrated with the logos at the bottom of the slide. Our focus is on the practical restoration of those habitats that, without our intervention, will never recover, particularly salt marsh, seagrass and oysters. Rememory, with an England focus, started in 2018 and has gradually been gathering momentum. Our conference in 2019, Restoring Estuarine and Coastal Habitats in the North East Atlantic, REACH, takes our initiative to a more international ambition and is helping us to steadily grow a network, connecting practitioners and inspiring restoration at the coast. REACH 2 is planned in collaboration with Coastal Futures in January 21. I was asked to talk about carrying out restoration, the progress we've made and the pitfalls to overcome. One of the first steps was to articulate the problem we were trying to resolve, and also to recognise that restoration had to be a collaborative and partnering approach across government, industry, environmental NGOs, academia at national and local scales. Given the enormity of the task, breaking it down into bite-sized chunks was really important. This is helping us to gather together and focus the necessary expertise that each partner brings to the table, achieving much more together than we can working alone. I will touch on each of these in the slides that follow. Governance was and continues to be about getting the right leadership and buy-in around the table, understanding drivers and responsibilities and creating collective capacity to carry the initiative forward. We've established steering groups and developed a shared vision and mission for restoration, and we've started to reach out to industry groups and environmental NGOs to begin working in partnership. Our mission is to restore at least 15% of the initiative's priority habitats along the English coast, reversing their decline, creating habitats with multiple benefits for people and nature, such as contaminant absorption, fisheries, recreation, and coastal protection. Researching the problem and providing the evidence of the damage that's been done, the benefits that have been lost, that could be regained, was and continues to be an important consideration to help focus minds and think about our ambition and what is achievable. Setting the context within existing drivers like river basin and shoreline management plans, marine strategy and the Defra 25-year environment plan have all been key considerations too. Early on we needed to bring practitioners together to share knowledge and understanding, which we did through the REACH conference and various workshops, and we'll do again with Coastal Futures REACH 2 in January 21. We needed to work out practically what was the art of the possible for those habitats where intervention can work to aid recovery, where without our help there would be very little. The map here shows the restoration potential maps that have been developed using data sourced from the MMO, Natural England, EA and JNCC, published as part of the EA's River Basin Management Plan Challenges and Choices consultation. The consultation has been extended to the end of September to maximise stakeholder feedback given recent challenges. Please take a look and provide feedback if you can, not only on restoration of habitats, but on the wider issues of climate change, pollution, physical modification and protecting biodiversity. Your comments can and will make a real difference. We're also sharing best practice through technical groups and developing practical guidance. Very much a work in progress, we have the Native Oyster Restoration Manual on the verge of publication, thanks to a great partnership with the Native Oyster Network, facilitated by ZSL. The salt marsh, seagrass and beneficial use of dredge material manuals are starting to progress and will be completed in 21. We want these manuals to be the go-to guides for anyone who is interested in undertaking restoration projects, from industry to community groups, and as far afield as possible, given these habitats occur throughout the Northeast Atlantic. It's early days for the initiative. Our ambition is to have a larger funded programme, strategically led, supported nationally with local partnership and delivery. To realise this, we're developing a funding and finance strategy to raise the estimated additional 250 million needed to achieve a 15% increase in our priority habitats. Over what timescales is up for debate. Should it be the end of the 25-year environment plan in 2043 to an estimated 11 million per annum, or should it be sooner? As well as conventional grant funding opportunities, we're also exploring more innovative finance approaches in partnership with businesses and industry. The strategy will identify where we and our partners can source these funds and where we can work with stakeholders to promote future opportunities, using natural capital approaches and net gain. We're also reviewing how enforcement undertakings might contribute. At the moment, we have limited capacity and we are focusing on demonstrating to potential funders the multiple benefits that would arise if we were able to invest more. This slide shows some typical restoration activities, including restructuring a salt marsh, laying of mulch for oyster restoration, breaching of seawalls to flood historically reclaimed land that would have previously been salt marsh, and collection of seagrass seed. All of these restoration activities potentially have impacts which regulatory authorities need to assess, and most importantly, also need the support of local people and businesses. Everyone agrees good regulation is needed to protect the benefits we receive from the marine environment. But when it comes to public good activities, the current regulatory regime is acting as a barrier, potentially prohibitively so, particularly to smaller restoration projects where cost can be a significant component of the overall cost of the project. Going forward, we're all in agreement that we need an enabling environment to promote restoration for public and environmental good. We're looking into options of how we can help streamline regulation for projects that are promoting that good. Options include changes in legislation, probably the least favoured option in the current climate. Such changes would need careful consideration to ensure we maintain existing protections. Other options include making sure we have sufficient guidance in place, like the manuals that I just mentioned, to support projects. These help set standards and can guide more on what information is needed, drawing on case studies which will help streamline processes. Having the right information up front helps case officers to process applications in good time and reduce costs. It also helps get buy-in from local people, which can be one of the biggest challenges to overcome. We can also look at access to support funding for projects, training for case officers, and providing advice notes on specific types of restoration that might be expected in future. Some of that will come from the restoration manuals. Without legislative change, there is still so much more that we can do. Finally, the most important aspect is about on-the-ground action and restoration in practice. We're not starting from scratch. As an example, the Environment Agency, working in partnership with Natural England, local authorities and environmental NGOs, has decades of intertidal habitat creation expertise through the building of flood defences and their infrastructure at the coast. Local partnership has been critical to their success. Increasingly, our flood risk strategy is looking at nature-based solutions. We're building a partnering approach with pilot projects, some of which are well developed or new, such as those with the UK and Ireland Native Oyster Network, and Natural England's Life Recreation Remedies Project, which covers seagrass, and the WWF Sky Ocean Rescue Project. My closing slide makes use of Tony Lobert's art, one of the many legacies from Plymouth Marine Laboratory's NERC-funded CoastWeb project. It captures beautifully our future ambition in drawing these approaches together, focusing our efforts not on single habitats, but at land or seascape scale, restoring multiple habitats at the same time with the combined expertise of our partners. We recognise that the next step for many pilot projects is to scale up. We want to support the development of a much larger programme. For this to take place, we need to demonstrate confidence around scalability and the return on investment. We do have experience at the coast of doing large-scale restoration, particularly in relation to managed realignment. So let's build on that and work together to increase our capacity, pool our expertise, and make practical restoration happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers and panelists. That was an excellent start. If I could ask all of our speakers to turn their video on again. Again, my name is Simon Leadbetter, and I'm going to be taking us through the Q&A. We're going to make sure we get through as many questions as possible. If you have a question you'd like to ask the panel, please put it in the Q&A section that you'll find a link to at the bottom of your screen. If I ask the speakers also to mute themselves before I throw a question at you. But before we start, it's worth saying that this is just the start of a discussion, or part of a discussion that is ongoing and can be much bigger. As this is going on, there's a lot of activity online. We have several hundred people watching on YouTube. It's also worth saying that Blue is posting at this moment a post that we'd like you to do something with. It's hard to believe, but of the 400 or so people that are engaged this morning, if we all shared that tweet, personalized it, liked it, shared it, but more importantly, personalized it by responding to it, by adding your own commentary, it could reach hundreds of thousands of people. It's a very effective way of getting this debate really triggered from this event. So this event just doesn't become a standalone event, but the start of a conversation. What that says is we all need to work together to remove barriers to active marine restoration and encourage regulators to join us. Let's make Rewilding the Sea possible. If we can all share that while we're here this morning, we will generally start a really live debate and reach hundreds of thousands of people. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, vote them up if you really like them. And when I throw a question at you, if you could unmute yourself, we can actually then start and we'll go on as long as we can before we break for lunch. So our first question is to Richard Benyon, who speaks very knowledgeably of the marine management landscape in England. Does he or the HPMA panel feel that we have the ability to deliver innovative marine management within the current legislative framework, or should we be looking to review the Marine and Coastal Access Act and the Marine Policy Statement more than a decade after they were put in place? And that's from Dick and Howell.
Thank you. Well, we looked at this, and we think there are actually simpler legislative routes down which to go, and it's all in the report. I haven't got the time to go through it now, but one of the reasons that we recommended that highly protected marine areas are located within marine protected areas is that the legislation exists to create those latter designations, and so it's relatively easy to create a higher level. And also you can then compare, and one of the graphs I showed was the difference between protecting in a higher level, higher method compared with a marine protected area, and you can compare the two. And one of the things we just don't know is how this will work, how successful it's been, because in the UK waters, we've only got 2 or 3 very small sites. And so we need to do this on scale. The legislation exists. And also there is adequate scientific research. Well, one of the things that I beg on my knees is that we don't start saying that we need to go out there and gather vast amounts of new scientific data and spend years doing it and commissioning huge amounts of work. It exists, particularly in the areas that are currently at some level of protection, and therefore it is relatively easy to get on with it. But the most important thing is that it's done with real engagement with local communities, with sea users of all types, and it's perfectly possible to do it relatively quickly.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Andrew Oliver. At present, wind farm developers are not providing compensation to fishers for operational phases, as they insist fishing can resume once construction is complete. Why does the offshore renewable industry and/or government not accept all fishing is banned inside the arrays, as it seems to be in the Netherlands, and use the arrays as official rewilding areas? I think that may be for you, Gareth.
Yeah, that's quite a tricky one to answer. I mean, we work ever so closely with the fishing industry in order that they're not excluded from our wind farms. We have fisheries liaison officers who work with local fishery groups. So fishing does occur within the wind farms in the UK currently.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question for Philine. If investment in marine restoration could be scaled up to hundreds of times the magnitude, what could we actually achieve?
Sky's the limit.
That's a beautifully brief answer, but I'm sure.
It is true. I mean, I think, especially in these early phases, some of these restoration projects are expensive up front. But what we have shown through our work in the United States is that actually it also pays economic dividends back into the economy directly, both through enhancing those ecosystem services and through job creation. It also, there's an increasing body of evidence about human well-being and interaction with the oceans, which restoration can play a really key part in as well. So we could do a lot is the answer. I think really what we've shown through the restoration is that anything is possible. You have to be clever about where you put things, and you have to be clever about how you do it, but anything is possible. And I think what we've shown is that the returns mean that that investment can more than pay for itself.
Thank you, Philine. Again, one for you, Richard. This is from Jeremy Percy. How do you square the circle of closing off areas, often inshore, for rewilding with the clear impact that will have both economically and socially on the small boat coastal fishermen on the UK?
One of Jerry's points very occupied a lot of our time. Firstly, consultation and engagement at an early stage. Secondly, an understanding that whilst larger fishing vessels and other marine activities can move elsewhere, the smaller inshore fleet and right down to the small artisanal vessel can't. And there is a greater impact on them, and they will need support. And it wasn't within our remit to tell the government about the extent that should go to. But my personal view is that coastal communities are profoundly important. They are to our marine environment. They also, the fishing industry in them is part of their sense of self-worth and the communities that they support. And therefore the government need to recognize that they need help. And if we are asking them to do something elsewhere, we need to think of them and favor support in that direction. I also extend my reply to talking about recreational angling. And I think that the charter boat industry will certainly be looking at this with some trepidation. Many of them have taken clients to fish in particular parts of the sea because that's where fish have aggregated, and we debated long and hard about recreational angling, and I'm afraid the evidence was that it's not something that we would say fitted in with the definition of an HPMA, but there are benefits to all these interests from what I described in my remarks as the spillover effect. And I hope that Jerry's inshore fishermen and anglers and other interests will see that benefit fairly quickly, and that their displacement concerns will be actually alleviated by the fact that an increased biomass, increased size of fish, and a healthier ocean generally.
Thank you, Richard. One for you, Roger. It seems that there's a shared ambition between both regulators and practitioners. Based on your experience with REACH, where do the obstacles to large-scale marine restoration lie, and how do we overcome them?
It's the capacity to scale up. That's our biggest challenge, and acquiring the funding necessary to allow that capacity to grow. And one of the areas that is kind of weak for us is gathering the evidence together to show the return on investment. And we need better evidence and information, some of which Philine has obviously alluded to with the tool that they're developing, to be able to get that return on investment. So that's a real strong area of focus for us at the moment in terms of bringing those tools and evidence together to give people confidence to invest, to give us the capacity to then scale up.
Thank you, Roger. Again, from the audience, one of our more popular questions from Rebecca Plant. I'm pleased to see the work of the community of Arran Seabed Trust in the designation and management of Lamlash Bay NTZ, no-take zone, being celebrated here and in the Benyon Review. What role do you see coastal communities playing in rewilding our seas across the UK? How can communities be empowered to take part? Who would like to take that? Mr. Benyon.
Lamlash Bay, Arran is a great place to visit anyway, but to see what the community of Arran Seabed Trust have achieved, not only in terms of the ecology and the recovery of species within that highly protected marine area, but also how it's engaged local people. And a point on enforcement, I mean, you couldn't do anything in that area without being seen by local people who now feel a real sense of ownership over that HPMA. And I think this is a model for other inshore sites. And it's very important that we recommended both inshore and offshore sites as HPMAs. But when you can engage a community and they can see the tourism and the other benefits that can come from this, it's an infectious thing to experience. And what's happened in Arran, can be replicated around our coasts. But it's crucial that we learn from the mistakes of the reference sites. And that is why I see there's questions about the intertidal area. We do not believe the intertidal area fits within this. There are other ways of creating higher protections for the intertidal sites. This is for inshore and offshore waters. It's about the ecology of the sea, but it's also about blue carbon, and that is increasingly important.
Thank you very much. Just a quick one for Gareth. As we have both corporate and organisational people on the call, the discussion, large companies move slowly and the ocean needs rapid support. How could industry expedite marine restoration? Others may join in, but Gareth, to you.
I mean, I don't think we work particularly slowly. If someone approached us with a research proposal or a project or a partnership, we would be able to respond to that fairly quickly as an individual developer. As a sector and through a sector group, I think we may move less slowly, but we collaborate with many universities directly with funding deadlines, etc. So I think we can turn things around pretty quickly, and we often have very concrete milestones in terms of construction and operation of our projects that we're very loath to move. So in terms of programs of works, you can actually predict well in advance exactly what's going to happen if you want to operate in and around a development.
Fantastic. I'm just very conscious of time, and we do want to give people a lunch before we start an afternoon session. If we just go round the panel quickly with a one word or slightly more answer, start with you, Richard, for you specifically. If you could say one thing to all of the stakeholders whose reaction is opposition to high levels of protection, what would it be?
First of all, get in touch and get involved in the development of our 5 pilot sites. We didn't, because of COVID, we weren't able to recommend which those sites should be around the English coast, but they will, I think, see their concerns be alleviated to a great degree, and that they can work with government to make sure that as further HPMAs are rolled out, that those can be achieved. Just very quickly on wind farms, I think we've got to be understanding of the huge possibilities of rewilding the sea within wind farms, and we shouldn't be too hidebound that that every 20 years or so they might need to relay cables or replace turbines, and that the benefits for sort of co-location of marine protection at a high level can work very well with other human activities. And I think we just need to be a little bit more open-minded about accepting this in the future.
Thank you very much, Richard. So just round the panel, a very quick final question. If you had a crystal ball or a wish, what is the one thing that you would really like any party, NGOs, government, whoever, to do to really affect change? So what is the one thing that if we had a wish list to go, that would be my #1 priority? Is it fair, as your mute's already off, Richard, to come to you first?
Political will, and in fairness to the government, I think the political will exists. I think it's fantastic that it's a cross-party political will, that this is on a glide path to a future which is much better because politicians of all persuasions support it.
Fantastic. So shall we go to Roger? if you unmute.
I would say leadership and participation is key. We get things done by developing relationships, decisions get made with emotions, and hopefully the funding will follow that kind of leadership and getting involved and building relationships.
Thank you, Roger. Philine, one thing.
I'd say that having worked with native oyster restoration on the ground here in Europe for a decade or so, I think the relationships are there. I think people are eager and people are willing to work together and learn from each other. There just isn't enough resources going into it. So we need more money.
More money. I like it. Thank you, Philine. Gareth?
Yeah, I think we need to be more flexible in terms of working with industry and not be afraid to fail with all the uncertainties in the offshore environment. I think we should try some initiatives and see what works.
Fantastic. Thank you all very much. I think we've come to time if we're going to allow people to actually self-serve their own lunch. Thank you to all our panelists. On behalf of Blue and our sponsor DP World, thank you to all the speakers from early this morning and just now. Thank you so much for your brilliant contributions. Also, thank you to the audience. I know we've hardly got into the questions that you've actually been asking, but we will gather all those and look at how we answer. So to the team at Blue who've put all this together and have hosted us. Also like to thank Mindfully Wired, who've been very careful and brilliant at getting us all together and all the technology, all as amateurs working on this technology in what seems to be quite a professional way. And also to the many volunteers who've made this actually happen today. It's worth saying and re-stressing again, we would really love you to share or respond to that tweet. Like it if that's all you can do, but if you respond and add your own expert comment on that, and that makes it your own and it starts the debate, we can genuinely, with the 400 or so people who've engaged with us on YouTube and on Zoom, reach hundreds and hundreds of people. We will be gathering opinions after the event, so do watch your inboxes because we'll be sending communications about this and also on social media. If you look online at bluemarinefoundation.com and also on social media with @BlueMarineF and follow the hashtag Rewilding the Sea. So it just left me to say thank you to everyone who's contributed this morning. We're about to close our YouTube session. So thank you from Blue, from DP World, and I look forward to continuing the conversation online at future, hopefully face-to-face events.